Good morning, everyone. Welcome back and welcome to today's hearing. Today we're going to hear closing statements from some of the core participants in relation to Module 5 and the first part of Module 6, which was concerned with firefighting. The first we're going to hear from is Mr. Friedman, Queen's Counsel, on behalf of some of the bereaved survivors and residents. Good morning. Yes, Mr. Friedman.
The failures of the LFB at Grenfell Tower were sixfold, all foreseeable, all preventable, and all in their own way causative of the extent of loss of life. 1. Firefighters and managers remained in ignorance of catastrophic construction risks posed by cladding fires, even though those risks were known about within the organisation and cladding fires were increasing in their frequency in the UK and around the world. 2. Premises risk assessments were carried out incompetently and in a fashion that did not meet the requirements of law, policy, or the safety of firefighters or members of the public. 3. The incident command system, in terms of its training, continuing education, and preparation, was profoundly insecure, with anything out of the ordinary liable to overcome it. 4. There was no developed thinking at all, let alone teaching and guidance about how to support high-rise residential evacuations. 5. The LFB tolerated inadequate fireground radio communications, and especially so in relation to the Barry headsets that firefighters wear to communicate with their bridgehead and incident commanders, but which do not work properly in high-rise buildings. And finally, 6. The control room was simply unable to cope with a complex incident involving multiple cores. The fireground and control could not coordinate properly, and the result was to make matters worse, indeed far worse. Each of these 6 failures was foreshadowed at Lacknell House in 2009. That fire involved rapid external spread across cladding panels. The premises was woefully under-assessed. The incident commanders were overwhelmed. Residents self-evacuated without stay-put advice being revoked. Radios did not work, and the control room provided false reassurance that firefighters were on their way when they were not. The repeat of these failures should be deeply unsettling to anyone who has studied the evidence. They have caused the present Commissioner to accept that the organisation can no longer expect to be trusted, but must prove that it can be. It was notable that even when inquiry witnesses were able to identify and indeed regret their errors, many still found it difficult to explain them. An organisation can no more trust itself than be trusted if it cannot recognise why it has failed. Those explanations are not just about blaming external forces. They lie in the deeper roots of governance, culture, and education. And can I ask for the documents manager to therefore bring up BSR 50101, which is our table on failures and underlying explanations. The failures are on the top line. I've just set them out. But the underlying explanations are in the line below: governance, culture, education, health and safety compliance, and accountability. It's that line below that needs to be properly looked at, because the leadership and the FBU are fearfully defensive about criticising anything that is perceived to go to their core identity and values. Panel, there are deep-rooted problems that need to be addressed. As we said in the opening, if not now, when? And if you don't deal with underlying causes in your report, who will? Turning then to those failures, we start with catastrophic construction risk. And we can take the table down, please. The inquiry knows that hazards of cladding systems, including their constituent parts, were documented in landmark reports and national policies from 1999 through to 2014. This included reporting by Parliamentary Select Committee, generic risk assessments, and national operational guidance. If we stop just there, the LFB would have been negligent not to prepare. However, despite denials by some witnesses, Lacknell House was, amongst other things, a cladding system fire, and significant parts of the LFB knew this. Commissioner Dobson wrote to the government in December 2009 to warn them of the causal contribution of external wall panels at Lacknell House that he feared were more widely used. In March 2010, the LFB submitted a study of tall buildings to the Greater London Assembly that pointed to polymeric material which it advised was probably now prevalent around the sector and which could spread fire through innovative construction designs such as cladding systems, bypassing cavity barriers or fire-stopping measures. In a further letter to government, in December 2012, Commissioner Dobson asked for better guidance on building regulations, quote, particularly with regard to the spread of fire over the external envelope of the building, and not least because such a fire, particularly in tall buildings, has the potential to affect multiple stories simultaneously, thus making firefighting more difficult. The Lacknell inquest concluded in March 2013. Amongst other things, the coroner recommended that the government review requirement B4 of approved document B to the building regulations. She too asked for, quote, regard to the spread of fire over the external envelope of the building and the circumstances in which attention should be paid to whether proposed work might reduce existing fire protection. In a separate letter to Commissioner Dobson, the coroner recommended that steps be taken to ensure that incident commanders were given enhanced training to anticipate that a fire might behave in a manner inconsistent with the compartmentation principle. The LFB's downfall at Grenfell Tower was caused by this external recognition about the risk of cladding fires not translating into sufficient internal action to teach the rest of the organisation about them. The failure was firstly vertical, because there should have been effective transfer of knowledge down to the station-based firefighters. National guidance in the GRA 3.2 required training and competency to develop knowledge, skills and understanding for firefighters on the impact of fire on the building's construction, and recognition of the signs and symptoms of risk of rapid and unpredictable fire spread and the adoption of appropriate tactics to mitigate these. However, none of the training, including the specially commissioned Lacknell House case studies and incident command exercises, ever prepared operational firefighters to know about, let alone effectively respond to, a rapid external fire spread or breach of compartmentation on multiple floors. The LFB failure to educate its station-based firefighters is all the more inexcusable because in the 2 years before the Grenfell Tower fire, the Fire Safety Department did the following things. It trained itself about the risk of cladding fires in those various presentations that the inquiry has seen. It continued to write to local authorities about the risk of cladding panels as it did in April 2017 with regard to the Shepherd's Court fire. It drafted letters to government signed by the newly appointed Commissioner Cotton, continuing to decry the weaknesses of the regulatory regime, and it even participated through DAC Hughes in an external conference where it advised others on the dangers of cladding fires. All of that points not only to a vertical failure to transfer knowledge down, but horizontal failure across the governing structure of the LFB. The failure of communication is striking. None of the senior figures saw the tall building's facade slides. Many of the leading officers who the inquiry has heard from did not see or know about Commissioner Dobson's correspondence with government. Several key figures did not sufficiently appreciate the doubts that had been raised about the stability of the regulatory system. Neither could they recognise that fires at Lacknell House and Shepherd Courts foreshadowed the risk of whole building cladding fires and therefore a Grenfell Tower. Various witnesses told you that the Fire Safety Department remained in a silo, and in that silo it made its disastrous error to assume that documented international examples of cladding fire infernos could not happen in England because of the strength of our regulatory system. The assumption was made without systematically studying the evidence of the foreign fires, including their regulatory context, or seeking national fire service or government intervention to do so. It ignored the Commissioner's letters to government calling attention to the weakness of the regulations. it lost sight of the various papers produced by DC Dexter between 2000 and 2014, which both challenged the preconception that building failure was rare and doubted the competency of external assessors to comply with fire safety laws. The fact that the scale of the fire construction catastrophe at Grenfell Tower was unprecedented in the UK fighting history can be no consolation for the truth that its dangers were foreseeable to the LFB. Panel, from that failure of foresight, all other failures followed. From Lacknall House to Grenfell Tower, the LFB remained in breach of its premises assessment duties because it neither taught its employees to identify cladding systems or discharged its duties under statute, guidance and policy to make sure that the risk was documented as part of standard planning for high-rise fires. Guidance from the Health and Safety Executive made it clear from 2010 onwards that the collection and accessibility of risk-critical information, including construction hazards, was an essential function of pre-planning for operational incidents. The government's poorest guidance in 2012 provided that information gathering duties under Section 72D of the Fire and Rescue Services Act extended to details of construction type of a building, including any cladding materials and internal linings, as well as occupancy risks concerning restricted mobility, limited comprehension, arrangements for assistance in evacuation, and children aged 6 and below. From 2011, the LFB high-rise policy, PN 633, had already expanded in Appendix 1 to 22 matters to be considered during 72D assessments, which included construction features that could promote rapid abnormal fire spread. The revised GRA 3.2 equally placed importance on the discipline of pre-planning, both in terms of comprehending construction hazards that could accelerate external fire spread or breach of compartmentation, and, unlike the local policies, expressly cited cladding systems as one such hazard. The details of the LFB's failure to plan are as follows. First, since the inquiry discovered what it called the woefully inadequate entries on operational risk database for Grenfell Tower, the LFB has established that the inadequacy was not an isolated phenomenon. Commissioner Rowe, who became AC for fire stations in December 2017, told you that a full audit of the entire LFB database had discovered a range of inconsistencies, poor information, and a misunderstanding about risk necessitating a mass education programme. Second, Lacknall House should have been a lesson in the perils of an under-assessed building. The local authority was in breach of numerous duties under the fire safety order. None of the breaches had been established in LFB's Section 72D inspections of the building or by other information gathering requirements. Third, in the years after Lacknall House, the LFB did not comply with its own policy or national guidelines, even though AC Browne provided repeated assurances that the system was both robust and compliant. The poorest guidelines were never embedded into LFB practice. No one at station level talked of them. No London policies refer to them. A planned study to ensure consistency across stations in identifying operational risk or hazard never took place. There was no system to require 72D assessments to establish whether occupancy profile included residents who would have had difficulty evacuating due to vulnerability, comprehension, and physical or psychological impairment. Fourth, AC Browne and AC George were provided with a paper from GM Elwell in December 2013 that told them in terms that there were substandard entries on the database and that the LFB faced a serious issue of non-compliance with its own service standards. AC Browne blocked the paper's recommendations and settled for a system that focused on only on the quantity of premises visited, despite this red light advice he had received on the quality of the work being done. Fifth, training, insofar as it was delivered, was not good enough. The various witnesses responsible for the training had to accept that, amongst other omissions, it made no reference to various matters featured in Appendix 1 of PN 633, or to the modern methods of construction cited in PN 800. It also did not teach crews how to actually do a premises risk assessment. The gist of A.C. Browne's evidence was that people could learn on the job. The extraordinary, worst of all world situation that prevailed before the Grenfell Tower was therefore, 1, law and policy over several years required stations to consider construction features of buildings as part of their 72D duties. 2, senior officers repeatedly told you that they did not believe average station firefighters had the technical aptitude to carry out the task. And 3, nothing was done to either enhance station crew competency through training or to delegate the task to competent others. Professor Torero argues that crews absolutely should and could have been trained to follow simple instructions to identify cladding. Steve McGurk agrees. As DC Dexter once suggested in relation to insulation materials, these kind of things are not rocket science. And yet the root of this failure lies in management's belief that firefighters are either incapable or unwilling to learn such a fundamental skill, regardless of what was required by policy or the law, as well as their safety and the safety of others. We say the failure of premises risk assessment set the incident commanders up to fail, which leads to the third core failure before the inquiry, that the LFB's incident command management system was insecure anyway. In March 2010, the HSE issued guidance entitled Striking the Balance Between Operational and Health and Safety Duties in the Fire and Rescue Services. It focused on sudden, unexpected or unexperienced dangers at incident grounds that required development in the psychology, knowledge and preparation of commanders through training and the provision of information to them on hazards, risks and control measures. Additional government guidance, issued in 2013, endorsed the Striking the Balance analysis, adding that command training and management needed to learn human factor aspects of decision-making. The National Operational Guidance Programme then issued new policy which recognised that psychological as well as technical training was necessary to produce competent incident command. The evidence of Dr. Cohen-Hatton suggests that the reform programme did not find a comprehending or progressive learning environment in the LFB. Commissioner Rowe, who comes from a military background, was also struck by the lack of non-technical training for making decisions under emergency conditions when compared either to combat engagement or policing. The failure to adopt the National Decision Control Policy, or DCP, in place of the long-standing decision-making model, or DMM, is particularly indicative of the barriers that the LFB faces in change-making. The two models are strikingly different. The DMM incorrectly assumes a rational and reflective decision-making process, whereas the DCP regards that assumption as part of the problem and guides the decision-maker to review reflex assumptions before acting. Dr. Cohen-Hatton's combined understanding of academia, national policy, and LFB operational training confirmed to her that the DMM does not describe the way that people actually think in real-world emergency environments, and research shows that it is not used even when users claim to be relying on it. The formal reasons given by operational assurance not to adopt the national guidance do not stand up to scrutiny. DCP had been verified by research and had been adopted nationally. Of equal importance, long-term research had undermined the DMM as a decision-making tool because of its lack of controls to prevent the mental traps of cognitive bias and primed recognition. It was said that the DCP did not have an equality impact assessment, but the LFB never sought one. It also ignored the rebuttal opinion from Cardiff University that the DCP provided for greater scaffolding for decision-making for those with dyslexia. However, the DMM has also never been the subject of an equality impact assessment. nor has it otherwise ever been established as a safe decision-making tool beyond its broader management consultancy origins in the 1950s. The dominant motive for pushback on the reform was its perception that it was too much too soon for a brigade that was struggling to train incident commanders on the basics, let alone matters that were new to operational thinking. The inquiry now knows that the training of incident commanders was truly poor in terms of technical learning on construction risks and non-technical learning on the psychology of human error, with no detailed advice on how to exercise operational discretion, even if lives depended on it. Revalidation training was also repeatedly delayed due to lack of command subject matter experts both within Babcock and the LFB. Striking the balance foreshadowed these problems some 7 years before Grenfell Tower. Tellingly, Commissioner Cotton worked in operational assurances from 2012 onwards and led it at directorial level from 2015, but was not aware of the detail of striking the balance and confirmed that no internal auditing was ever conducted to consider whether the LFB was compliant with the guidance. It plainly was not. The fourth failure of the LFB at Grenfell Tower was the absence of any policy or taught method on how to carry out emergency residential evacuation from high-rise buildings. The long and convoluted consultation that led to the revised GRA 3.2 formulated a requirement for incident commanders to consider the need to reverse stay put, and importantly, to develop training and competency on the issue. However, these key changes on stay put came from civil servants intervening to enforce their Secretary of State's undertaking to the Lacknell coroner that policy change would come. Very little prior input on these issues came from the LFB or the National Fire Services or the FBU, who clearly all shared in what Peter Cowup has described as a blind spot on the issue. Those in the LFB's operational policy department who drafted the national and local documents did not consult upon or even think through the practical implications of the policy change. Lacknell House training packages did not teach incident commanders about residential evacuation. There was also no station training on the revised PN 633 to explain what had changed or developed in relation to reversing stay put and why. The ingrained tendency in LFB residential high-rise firefighting was to assume compartmentation rather than scrutinise its viability, and to focus on individual crew rescues rather than to theorise about evacuation. It was in that mindset that Commissioner Dobson told the Lacknell House inquest that he could not even imagine an alternative, more dynamic response to building failure. He emphasised that senior management saw departure from stay put as operationally problematic, but there was never a coordinated consultation with stations and other sources, including other services, to develop a formal evacuation doctrine. Evacuations, nonetheless, remain part of the natural behaviour of people in fire. And events like Lacknell House only encouraged high-rise residents to evacuate regardless of instructions. The reactions to these developments within the LFB was primarily to emphasise their risk management quality, rather than developing strategic responses to facilitate their inevitable occurrence. And yet significant evacuation did occur, including with the revocation of stay put that was ordered by LFB incident commanders both at Shepherd's Court fire in August 2016 and the Adair Tower fire in November 2015. Kent Fire and Rescue Services developed a method of high-rise firefighting by 2010, which had its roots in the previous decade. In contrast to the admitted gaps in LFB operational policy and training, this is a system informed by fire engineering, sceptical about regulatory compliance, and which assumes building failure and evacuation until compartmentation is shown to hold. It uses rapid reconnaissance teams to check for evidence of smoke spread above the fire floor on the practical basis that it cannot be justifiable to advise residents to stay put in places in the building that the firefighters have not yet checked. Kent training uses the RICE decision-making tool that helps incident commanders to evaluate under the stress of emergency whether it is safer to prioritise rescue, evacuation and containment of a high-rise fire as opposed to automatic intervention to try to fight the fire. Trainees are taught to identify triggers that would prompt decision-making on the reversal of stay put, being fire development, smoke travel, self-evacuation, and compromised staircases. These are features of the fire that we would emphasise were apparent to early crews that arrived at Grenfell Tower and those in control, especially taking those calls up to 1:30 and 1:31. But they had no training or policy to act upon them. Similar reassessment prompts of this nature are now written into all relevant LFB policies, and as AC Cowup accepted, this should have been done before Grenfell. If there was a proper inter-service dialogue in the UK, then Kent members should have encouraged a national debate. Instead, the LFB have claimed that they knew nothing about them, although recollections differ. Either way, the fact remains that the LFB paid little attention to a paradigm-shifting policy and training method adopted amongst its neighbouring southeast services in circumstances where they had no doctrine of their own. The oversight was indicative of a London-centric attitude, which Commissioner Dobson accepted in evidence and was trying to address in his period in office. It speaks to a national disconnect which cannot be allowed to continue to exist when it comes to generic risks applicable to all urban fire and rescue services. As the inquiry has studied the night of the fire like no other previous investigation of its kind, it is well to remember what firefighters instinctively feared about triggering an evacuation in the building. Watch manager Dowden thought distressed people confused in that environment made it very, very difficult. Watch manager O'Keefe believed it would be impossible and would cause a huge catastrophe. DAC Fenton wanted to prevent a mass exodus and panic. Commissioner Cotton declared that it would have ended with a significant number of crush injuries, with a number of people panicking and trying to get out via a single staircase. As AC Cowup agreed, this was an overstated view and referred to his own experience of the 7/7 bombings, which indicated the extent to which people were able to behave calmly, especially when not directly in the vicinity of explosions. The future development of evacuation strategy will have to counter the panic myth and to harness the resilience of the crowd rather than to fear it. That requires better understanding that residents can support themselves and others in evacuating from their homes, as has long been the case for commercial buildings, and which is detailed in a generation of research on actual disasters. What we want is for this inquiry to contribute to that body of learning. The fifth failure is that the radio equipment worn by the firefighters at Grenfell Tower didn't work properly inside high-rise buildings. Its intrinsically safe status compromised its transmission capacity, even though nothing else that firefighters take into buildings on fire, including the equipment designed to mitigate the transmission of these to mitigate the problems of the transmissions of these radios, is itself so-called intrinsically safe. Professor Johnson and Professor Terrero agree that the equipment was therefore disproportionately sensitive for use in environments that it was not made for, and unjustifiably dangerous given how badly it works when used in those environments. From that, the key points can be taken quickly. First, almost every firefighter asked about this during Phase 1 told you that the problems with the Barry radios were well known. Second, that is correct. Institutional knowledge dates back several decades from fires arising from high-rise incidents and other disasters, both nationally, for instance, the King's Cross fire, and internationally, the World Trade Center. Government risk assessment drew attention to the need for contingency planning in the event of communication failures from 2006 onwards. Third, Lacknall House could have been a moment for change. The LFB's communication department internally proposed a wholesale review as the problem would inevitably reoccur in other high-rise structures. But this was not actioned, partly because Commissioner Dobson saw the issue as primarily one of ill-disciplined use of radio channels. Fourth, while other services in the UK and around the world replaced their low wattage intrinsically safe sets, the LFB did not. Neither did it ever conduct a formal risk assessments to balance out the dangers of losing communication in high-rise towers potentially all the time, as against the fanciful safety derived from the equipment that was never designed to support high-rise deployments. Fifth, GRA 3.2 required radio transmission to be considered on Section 72G visits, and then revised policy number 633 endorsed the need for contingency planning and expressly required potential communication problems to be given consideration on such visits. At Grenfell Tower, however, Barry sets were not tested, only the handheld radios, and then only to communicate during the visit rather than carry out systemic tests. Six, despite the LFB knowing of both the inadequacies of the equipment and the need to test effectiveness, their training did nothing to prepare station crews on either matter. And in fact, this training package, like other training packages, are one of the victims that got lost in the IT system and then were never delivered. All this fatally damaged situational awareness at Grenfell Tower, especially in the first hour of the response, when crews inside the building knew that smoke had spread to multiple higher floors. Although countless problems would arise with communication during the night, the lost opportunity to appreciate outright building failure in that first hour would have compelled an earlier reassessment of stay put, and that must undoubtedly be a significant factor. The final and the sixth key failure lies with the control room. It can be of no surprise that if the LFB as a whole failed to prepare for catastrophic construction risk and a consequential need to revoke stay put, that the control room also remained in a state of incompetency to meet those challenges. Be that as it may, the events during the Lacknell House fire are crucial to recall. Control had 1, assumed compartmentation, 2, offered false reassurance, 3, not coped with the volume of calls, 4, treated all fire survival guidance callers as requiring rescue without exploring their capacity for escape, 5, had no notion of if, when, or how to revise stay put advice, and 6, did not have effective two-way communication with the incident ground. We want to address you on 4 fundamental problems. First, despite a Lacknell House action plan to ensure that control was compliant with national guidance, it either failed to comply or simply overlooked key parts of the national requirements. Contrary to Fire Service Circular 10 of 1993, the FSG refresher training courses were reduced to only half days. The numbers who were trained drastically decreased after 2013 because of the competing needs to train on the use of Vision, the new call handling system. Active role play was not developed after 2010, at least in part because staff were embarrassed to participate in it. And after 2010, fire safety experts only sporadically delivered any training because of other competing needs. Record keeping was appalling, and there was never a structured training plan. There was an additional Fire Service Circular 54 of 2004. It contained a requirement to assess not only the situation, but the vulnerability of the caller by asking about age, gender, ethnicity, and mental or physical ability. The LFB reached an erroneous view that the circular did not add anything to pre-existing Circular 10, 1993, and therefore ignored it. In fact, 10, 1993 was silent on the issue. The LFB therefore failed to deal with vulnerable callers in either its policy, its reference information sheets, known as RIFs, or its training. There was then GRA 3.2, 2014, that added new requirements relating to control room call handling in the context of high-rise firefighting. Those included the requirement to be ready to re-evaluate stay-put advice in communication with incident command, and to have effective arrangements in place to manage calls from those unable to leave the building due to disability, poor mobility, illness, or the effects of fire. This was a major new policy that control room managers told you that they did not know about and therefore did nothing to comply with. The second shortcoming of control was key gaps in the local policies. Policy 539 on emergency call handling contained no warning of the dangers of providing false reassurance to callers and was therefore in breach of Circular 1093, which advised that this may not be appropriate and may even be dangerous in some circumstances. Appendix 3 of policy number 539 also suffered from potential confusion as to what it meant by affected by fire, heat or smoke, such as to require evacuation, and if so affected, how to assess fire behaviour to determine whether the caller was actually unable to leave. Policy 790 on fire survival guidance accepted in terms that in exceptional circumstances, incident command may inform control that their stay put advice should change. But the policy provided no explanation as to when or how this would be done, and there was no consequential training or amendment to the RIF prompt sheets by control to enable the change of advice to be made. POM Hayward's explanation was that control did not ever expect revoking stay put advice to happen. SOM Smith agreed, and therefore no more was done to prepare for the possibility that it might. The matter was also not revisited, as it absolutely should have been, when the new GRA 3.2 was finalised and expressly contemplated that incident commanders and control rooms should be ready to liaise on the revocation of stay put. The third problem with control service is that there was never a system to register how multiple FSG calls could function as an early warning basis to consider revoking stay put. POM Hayward did not know why the findings and indeed experience from Lacknell House, where control buckled under 5 calls, did not prompt a change of policy or training. He accepted that it should have done. However, during his time, none of the various joint training exercises matched the level of multiple FSG calls in Lacknell House, or anything more exacting. It was wrong to assume, as AC Browne did, that the buddy system of overflow calls going to other fire service operators could ever mitigate the problem. Indeed, seized with knowledge that the local LFB control room could struggle with situational awareness of what was occurring at a fireground, it was patently a folly to think that the Midlands or Strathclyde would do better. The final problem with control is that it failed to train or develop policy to deal with the assessment of vulnerable callers and those who were with them. This was contrary to national policy. It also constituted a failure to study the profile and characteristics of the deceased at Lacknell House. This is a point that does not get mentioned but should have been a core concern. Of the 6 who died, 5 were from black or other migrant backgrounds and 3 were children. Two of the adult deceased were in contact with control, as were the relatives and intermediaries of all 3 adults trying to seek information on their behalf. There was never any instruction on how to speak to a person whose first language was not English, or otherwise to be culturally sensitive to people from different backgrounds. Neither Policy 539 nor 790 were the subject of equality impact assessments. In their evidence, Hayward and Smith both committed the classic equality impact assessment error to assume that these matters could be dealt with by the intrinsic skills of the call handlers, without any evidence to support that assumption, and without developing a dedicated system to guard against discriminatory outcomes. That these main problems were allowed to languish in control for so long was foremost down to the basic managerial standards being fundamentally absent. A key criticism must be made of AC Browne, who line managed a system that was repeatedly the subject of internal reports, querying whether the service was working or whether agreed actions were completed. Dave Browne is the key figure in the years before Grenfell Tower who let these matters lie. But the organisation also left in place for over a decade an incompetent principal operations manager in Scott Hayward, who was simply not good enough to do the job. The single key performance indicator that he was required to meet was the speed in staff answering the phones. No other goals were written down, and neither he nor wider control management were held to account. The deeper problem was that control remained an insecure and depressed part of LFB service. It was always disconnected from operational firefighting, but it also treaded water for 5 years while it waited for the outcome of the regional fire control project that would have made London Control redundant. After 2012, it waited to see if the service would be privatised. It then struggled with the introduction of vision software that consumed management focus and available training time. As its fate was unknown, control training was never outsourced to Babcock. Anyone sentimental or predisposed against privatisation of training should consider the serious poverty in control room training as a salutary piece of evidence of what happens when the LFB was left to train itself. Control, therefore, remained in another of the LFB's silos. It lacked the voice, management and drive to transform. The result was a service that answered phones, deployed resources and might reassure callers, but it did not have the competency to become an intelligent, first and foremost line of response to people in danger. Neither could it be an information resource and partner to assist in incident ground decision making. The adverse consequences for Grenfell Tower were enormous. Panel, if those are the failures, then what are the underlying causes? Starting with governance. Almost every modern study of UK fire service has questioned the capacity of operational firefighters to competently rise from station to senior management without discrete education and the support of lateral hire from other industries. What you have seen in modules 5 and 6 in many ways is the comeuppance for failing to deal with that. On very basic levels, these managers did not understand fundamental features of their role, in which we include key performance indicators, record keeping, information exchange, handover, and quality assurance. Their vertical governance structure also encouraged directors and heads of service to become only focused on their own departments and tasks, rather than being integrated into a single service, which goes some way to explain why there were barriers to change and so many silos. The lack of management skills did real damage. Commissioner Dobson began his post knowing that fire safety was disconnected from the rest of the LFB and that the LFB was disconnected from the rest of the country. He retired almost a decade later, having solved neither problem. A.C. Browne, the third officer, presided over a flawed system of high-rise premises risk assessment and chronic mismanagement of the control room. A.C. Cowup spent nearly 4 years working on a high-rise firefighting policy, but left the LFB without guiding local policy and training into being ready to plan and evacuate in the event of whole building failure. AC, and then Commissioner Cotton, spent all of her senior leadership years in operational assurance, including applicable health and safety. But she did not assure service incident command readiness for catastrophic high-rise fire risks. She was then overwhelmed by the responsibility of the commissioner role, and but for the Grenfell Tower fire, she might have led the organisation in siloed incompetence for years to come. These people had no doubt excelled as operational firefighters and acted as good faith public servants, but they managed by metaphorically putting out fires rather than strategic insight and vision. They were as ill prepared for their management roles in the LFB as watch manager Dowden was ill prepared for his incident command at Grenfell Tower. The governance of the organisation was very much a product of its culture. It is a culture that runs deep and across leaders, union and rank and file, with some of its more problematic attributes being as follows. First, disproportionate virtue and status is afforded to traditional operational firefighting. Commissioner Dobson accepted the accuracy of the characterisation of operations as the big beast. Those who rose in the organisation held that big beast status. They excelled in engaging with fire, muscle memorizing the standard techniques, fitting into watch culture, and functioning as hands-on charismatic leaders. They were rarely women, higher education qualified, or inclined to intellectual horizon scanning. They represent an ideal of courage and community of service associated with the 19th century origins of firefighting. Dr. Badgett's study refers to the impression of the heroic rescuer contained in the art of the Foundation period to make the suggestion that at some deep level, firefighters only like to deal with the public if they can save them. Can I ask then for a picture cited by Dr. Badgett to be brought up? It's BS 50-100. And that is one of the paintings he looks at. It's Charles Vigor's Saved of 1892, and it hangs in the Fire Service College. It's an iconic image, and we say it forms part of the psyche of those that do this job, even if they find it difficult to be told that, especially by outsiders. And for those who think, well, this is a 19th century painting and it's part of the past, can I ask the document manager to compare it to the FSG training slide of January 2017, which is LFB 3060350, page 7, and have them side by side. A39 Blue Watch standard night shift. I don't know whether they saw the painting in the Fire Service College or it's just so deep that it's an iconic image. But they're similar. Same arm hanging down, same message. We say it's no good talking about blind spots without examining their reasons for becoming and staying blind spots. There is a group psychological cause to why operational response is disproportionately focused on rescue at the expense of any consideration of facilitated escape. On some very deep level, it just doesn't fit with the firefighter being the hero in the story. We could take the pictures down, please. Second, the flip side of operations being dominant was ambivalence towards less heroic tasks of fire protection and prevention. That is why fire safety struggled for recognition, both because its subject matter was non-operational, but also because all ranks, going right to the top, struggle with confidence and clarity over the subject. We have a service that dumbed down on the science of fire. You will recall the flippant exchange of emails between Danny Cotton and her team in operational assurance on the article about the Dubai Torch Tower fire and its flammable ACM cladding panels, which made reference to paragraph 12 of approved document B. Cotton explained the emails as a private joke and being flippant, essentially mocking those who made granular citations to subparagraphs on building regulations. If Cotton is telling the truth, she is saying that no one knew what they were talking about, and they were tragically taking the mickey out of the core regulatory issue that went on to cause the Grenfell Tower disaster. And in some ways, the truth is worse than them just having been negligent about picking it up. The third problem with culture was hierarchy and all the mistrust that goes with that. From the top to the bottom, there was and is an unnecessary fear of criticism, which is why intelligence reporting and performance review are perceived as punitive rather than educational, and why there was reluctance to embrace operational discretion for fear of being ill-judged. Managers, subordinates, stations, and unions all seem to forever be looking over their back, trying steadfastly not to be criticised, and consequently failing to develop and change. Symptomatic of the point is that we are 4 years into this inquiry, but still yet to hear the FBU regret anything about what it did or did not do. The last issue on culture is that all parts of the organisation have been too ready to assume that discrimination on grounds of race, sex, or disability has no impact on service outcomes. The focus has stuck on the willingness to save people from fires, but ignored everything else. On planning and control, we say discrimination undoubtedly damaged service outcomes. Core policies that affected gender, race and nationality and disability of residents were never equality impact assessed. National policy that in terms required consideration to be given to those matters as part of premises risk assessment and call handling were overlooked. It is an elementary feature of discrimination that no one within the LFB even noticed that these matters were not in focus until the evidence of this inquiry brought it to the fore. Disability needs were extraordinarily unconsidered across planning, control and evacuation. The lack of due regard has to be understood against a context in which people with disability are hugely underrepresented in fire services. Similar points can be made about ethnic minority and women members. The lack of diversity in representation inevitably impacts on diversity of thought, leading to gaps in service. Defensiveness and lack of curiosity on the subject is unnecessary and, in fact, an indication of the problem. If we turn then to education, the best way to understand why firefighters were not taught what they should have been taught is to recognise that most of the failures uncovered by this inquiry were of limited consequences to the normal course of fireground operations. The problems did not arise and therefore the weaknesses did not show. The neglectful omission to train for outright building failure might therefore be understood as the failure to have due regard to the risk of normalcy. In other words, the potential for the statistical and experienced norm to overly condition both expectation and aspiration for what the organisation should be preparing for. That is the normalcy that impacted on the education of the LFB, and it provides the essential backdrop for the critique of competency provided by Professor Torero. An organisation, especially an emergency service in a major capital city, will be fragile if it evolves too heavily by reference to past statistical likelihoods without also considering less common but foreseeably severe impact future events. High-rise residential firefighting was particularly exposed on this front. Past statistics, for instance, those claimed in the LGA guide that refer to 22 evacuations of more than 5 persons during 8,000 fires in flats in 2009 to 10, tell you something about frequency. But as Torero emphasised, they tell you nothing about severity. They also do not reflect that risk associated with the built environment is not static, such that modern construction methods can quickly transform the probability stakes. For those reasons, Torero emphasises that foreseeable risk must always be multiplied by consequences, and particularly so when the rarity of an event happening was lessening, as it was with cladding fires, and the adverse consequences, if it happened, were potentially catastrophic. That panel is the fundamental flaw in the LFB's education system. There may have been problems with the content and delivery of Babcock training, but an emergency service that educates itself only in the bounds of normalcy will be profoundly fragile in the face of the exceptional. Our further underlying cause is that the LFB fell chronically into breach of health and safety obligations. The 1999 Management of the Health and Safety at Work regulations require systems to be in place to risk assess, plan, inform and train. The fire service related guidance issued by the HSC and DCLG from 2010 focused on addressing weakness in incident command and developing information exchange, both of which were to be properly supplemented by adequate training, policy and monitoring. It is manifestly the case that the LFB breached its duties under the regulations and discrete guidance, in that it unreasonably failed to sufficiently plan, inform and train in relation to 1, cladding system fires and other material sources of rapid and unusual fire spread, 2, the potential for multiple breaches of compartmentation, 3, revocation of stay put, and 4, methodology of emergency evacuation.
It otherwise failed to comply with the PORUS and GRA 3.2 documents, both with regard to preparing fire ground response to identify a cladding system fire, and with regard to establishing occupancy profile of vulnerable residents who were not able to self-evacuate or seek rescue. It equally failed to prepare control to play its integral part in the rectification of stay put, and provide its own protection of vulnerable and disabled resident callers. The BSR seek findings on the substance of those matters, but the inquiry should also report on how the health and safety standards that you have been referred to were not properly reflected upon in the decision-making of senior leadership, and compliance breaches were apparently unrevealed to them by internal assurance processes. Cumulatively, and without prejudice to the other wrongdoing discovered by this inquiry, this amounts to a serious violation of the state's duty to protect the right to life. Our last underlying cause is lack of accountability. The LFB and all other services in England and Wales operated for more than a decade without external inspection from Her Majesty's Inspectorate or any other independent, rigorous auditing as a direct consequence of government policy. The result was to leave the LFB without constructive expert criticism. Commissioner Rowe singles out this lack of scrutiny as a discrete explanation for the LFB's own failures at self-correction. At least by 2016, the danger of this lack of accountability was known to government, not least because upon return of the responsibility for fire service to the Home Office, Theresa May, as Secretary of State, took immediate steps to reintroduce the inspectorate function. What was not recognised then, but must be recognised now, is that the failures of the LFB did not take place in a vacuum. They were forged in the crucible of government policy and practice. The inquiry is about to hear that fire service cover in government after 2006 was limited to a small department, which was cut considerably after 2010, and as a matter of political philosophy, was increasingly encouraged to oppose state involvement in the direction of local brigades. The dangers of excessive localism and the costs of running down the centre can be dramatically seen in the erosion of the LFB. Added to this, successive governments had presided over the degradation of the building regulatory system, such that residents and attending crews in high-rise urban environments were exposed to a risk of disaster that the state foresaw and contributed to, but did not take steps to prevent. In conclusion, the depth of the failures of the LFB that contributed to this disaster is shocking. The brigade was incompetent and incapable at every level to respond to a fire that was extreme but foreseeable, and it acted in breach of its duties under statute and policy. Those failings and their underlying causes ought to be recorded by this inquiry in a fashion that ensures that no fire service could ever forget them, and society from here on can steer its path by them. Also, the sooner the LFB publicly declares and acknowledges its own responsibility in acceptance of all the legal and reputational consequences this entails, the sooner it will be able to reclaim the trust that its present commissioner accepts that it must earn back. The bereaved and survivors will forever be connected with the LFB. Even though some were saved, many more deaths were avoidable, and those who were rescued were fortunate to survive. In their critical study of the evidence, the BSR have therefore done all they can to help the LFB improve, in memorial to those whose deaths were contributed to by its failures, and in support of the recovery of those who survived notwithstanding them. The fact that previous inquiries, inquests and reforms have been frustrated makes it all the more essential to achieve the deepest possible understanding of why these things went wrong at Grenfell Tower, in order for that understanding to act as the guide for what must now be put right. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Friedman. Well, the next statement is going to be made by Mr. Thomas, Queen's Counsel, but although it's a little earlier than usual, we'll take our morning break now to avoid interrupting what he's going to say to us. So we'll rise at that point. We'll resume, please, at 11:15. Thank you very much. The next statement is going to be made by Mr. Thomas, Queen's Counsel, on behalf of the bereaved survivors and residents whom he represents. So, good morning, Mr. Thomas.
Good morning.
When you're ready.
A wise person once said, mistakes are okay. They are our stepping stones of progress. If we are not failing from time to time, then we're not trying hard enough. We have to take risks, stumble, fall, and then get up and try again. Appreciate that we are pushing ourselves, learning, growing, and improving. One of the mistakes we fear might just be the link to our greatest achievement yet. However, these words of wisdom, for them to have power in our lives, there needs to be acknowledgement and ownership of what we have done wrong, so that we may improve and grow. It saddens me to say that at least one of the representatives for the interests of the LFB have made it clear that despite the mistakes we've heard about, they are not listening, they are not learning, they are not reflecting. Reading some of the FOA's closing submissions, you would be forgiven for thinking that we are living in some kind of parallel universe. I thought that they were doing some kind of lacanel on you, the inquiry. They don't like your findings in phase 1. They've already given a clear indication that they're not going to follow them. Indeed, they have indicated in their written submissions to you that they want you to revisit your phase 1 findings. This is arrogance of the highest level. The LFB need to be told, and told in no uncertain terms, that this is unacceptable. This is an affront to our clients and the memories of those who lost their lives. Modules 5 and 6 have shown in depressing detail the systemic failings of the LFB as an organisation with complacent, self-satisfied management structure and leadership who are seemingly unwilling or unable, or a combination of both, to undergo the difficult but necessary task of self-reflection and evaluation. An organisation that would, rather than face head-on the very justified criticisms of its structure, culture and training provisions, would rather block its ears to the clamour for change. In the course of my submissions, we will be making certain criticisms of the LFB concerning its failings and omissions. These will be fulsome and forceful, and I don't apologise for that. And we submit they are both important and valid, but let's not lose sight of the fact that the LFB did not cause the fire. They did not manufacture the materials used to refurbish Grenfell Tower. They did not make decisions based on maximisation of profit margins. They are not the ones who are undermining the building regulations and compliance. We have said this in previous openings and closing submissions, but it's worth repeating. Our clients do not criticise for the sake of it and make a clear and unequivocal demarcation between the brave men and women on the front line of the LFB who carry out an incredibly dangerous and brave job, while others run from a fire. It's their task to run into infernos. We submit, however, that the witnesses and the evidence heard in modules 5 and 6 have laid bare a number of serious systemic failings and inept leadership and management in the LFB as an institution. These witnesses were at times defensive and unforthcoming, with a marked reluctance to provide this inquiry with the open and frank answers that our clients were hoping for. The culture and structure of the LFB has undergone some scrutiny in these modules and has been found wanting. The hierarchy is rigid and inflexible and fosters an insular and over-prescriptive working environment. There was a clear lack of oversight and leadership and management levels of proaction and of evaluation. This all bred a culture of institutional inertia. At the conclusion of Phase 1, Sir, you, as Chair, noted those matters of particular concern, which would be further investigated in Phase 2. Matters of particular concern included, quote, the organisation and management of the LFB, and in particular in relation to the formulation of policy in the light of experience, the arrangement of training for firefighters and the control room staff, and the arrangement for sharing information about the particular problems associated with fighting fires in high-rise buildings. We contend that the LFB is an organisation that has woefully failed its employees, those on the front line who literally put their lives at risk answering any call-out. The leadership and management of the LFB do these brave men and women a total disservice. They failed Londoners, who look to the LFB for ensuring and maintaining fire safety in the capital. Moreover, the organisation has failed the bereaved survivors and relatives and their loved ones who died in the Grenfell Tower fire. We respectfully invite the inquiry to find that there was a series of systemic failings of the organisation, some long-standing, which coalesced with the catastrophic results on the night of the fire. We respectfully invite the inquiry to find that they were likely to have contributed to the loss of life. On the evidence, there have been systemic failings in 5 areas. Firstly, the Section 72D visits. Secondly, the incident command training. Thirdly, the control room training. Fourthly, the FSG management. And fifthly, the outsourcing of training for frontline firefighters. You see, these failings were against the backdrop of the organisation's quite frankly appalling response to the Lakanal House fire recommendations. On various points, it was either a failure to follow a recommendation through. At others, the coroner was misled as to what the LFB were doing to the extent that the recommendations were being implemented. At other points, the recommendations were simply ignored. In Andy Rowe, they have a new commissioner determined to ring in the changes. Commissioner Rowe is undoubtedly a talented and motivated individual. He, by the standards of the other LFB witnesses in these modules, was more candid, open, and prepared to take ownership of the LFB's failings. He spoke very eloquently of the shortcomings and the hopes and his aspirations for the future of the service. That is all to be welcomed and is heartening to hear. However, one man alone cannot change the culture and practices of an entire organisation. Mr. Rowe cannot change the political climate to one in which the public sector generally and our public emergency services in particular are afforded the status and commensurate funding that they deserve. Mr. Rowe alone cannot change local government. For let us not pretend that RBKC and the TMO are isolated examples of appalling practice and behaviour in local government in this country. The closing submissions from the CFO and the FOA show the divide and the chasm in opinion within the organisation. Added to that is the voice of the union, the FBU, who rightly point out that they had warned of cladding fires and their consequences for several years. And sadly, those warnings went unheeded. They also make it clear that the political and economic realities cannot be ignored. The scale of the task for the LFB is enormous, and the collective LFB evidence in modules 5 and 6 give our clients scant confidence that even with Mr. Rowe at the helm, the LFB has the will or the inclination to meet the challenges that it faces in terms of the way in which it is managed, its culture and structure, and its ability to learn and implement change. Let me turn to Lacanau. The abject failure to properly and systemically implement the Lacanau recommendations is nothing short of disgraceful. This is an organisation that is unable to reflect, unable to listen, unable to learn. The whole point of learning from previous disasters is to try to put in place measures and changes which mitigate against or prevent a repetition of a disaster. History is sadly littered with examples of organisations, institutions and individuals being unable or unwilling to learn from lessons of the past. It takes a non-historian, albeit an intellectual titan like Stephen Hawkins, to make the simple point: we spend a great deal of time studying history, which, let's face it, is mostly about the history of stupidity. History will judge the failures of the LFB, along with those of RBKC and the TMO and the corporate core participants, and the fact that they did not learn from Lacanau. It is indeed partly the history of stupidity. However, wedded to that, in the case of the LFB, was the severely inept and poor leadership, a culture that fostered institutional inertia, a lack of adequate training, little or no oversight from management, and a political climate of austerity and cuts. We make the point in our written submissions that the parade of LFB witnesses in modules 5 and 6 was a sorry, dour sight, lacking in motivation, dynamism, and ideas. There was an all-pervading lack of accountability. No one seemed to care enough about the recommendations from Lacanau to ensure that they were properly implemented, to ensure that words were translated into action, to ensure that the LFB were not simply undertaking a very expensive, time-consuming paper exercise to assuage the coroner's fears. Some in the LFB, if the recommendations were too difficult, too challenging, or contrary to the prevailing LFB beliefs, they were simply ignored. Such arrogance is inexcusable. Let me now turn to Section 7.2d. Section 7.2d is the foundation of knowledge and information gathering process upon which ultimately firefighting strategy is made. Its importance cannot be underestimated, yet the LFB's whole Section 7.2d process had been allowed to fail and fall into an appalling state. The fact that it was allowed to deteriorate to such an extent is a damning indictment on the LFB and its leadership, which they must own, acknowledge and rectify. There was a dereliction of duty on the part of the LFB that allowed the Section 7.2d visits to fall into decline and disrepute. As ever, with the LFB, there are no shortage of policies. There were no less than 4 policies relevant to Section 7.2d and familiarisation visits. There was the GRA 3.2, firefightings in high-rise buildings. There was PN 800, management of operational risk information. There was the PN 633, policy note on high-rise firefighting, and there was the provision of operational risk information systems, which provides guidance for risk and operational management and operational risk. In order to carry out an effective 7.2d visit, there will need to be pre-planning. which should have included the identification of the responsible persons, building owners, who should be present at the time of the visit, to have an understanding of the state of the building, its age, any refurbishments, etc. There needed to be detailed and sometimes lengthy or multiple visits and discussions with the responsible persons re any building regulation issues, building materials and the like. And there needed to be the necessary follow-up and write-up after the visit. The LFB has been subjected to the full brunt of austerity and cuts, both in terms of funding and numbers. This places even more pressures on the remaining crews. The LFB is not a business, it is a crucial emergency service serving the public. It must be properly resourced in order that it can fully discharge its responsibility and carry out its duties to their fullest. Most importantly, for effective 7.2D visits, proper oversight is needed in the form of an oversight body that can enforce and monitor the proper execution of the Act. And since the fire, the LFB has been undertaking their own internal review of the governance of the organisation, but we say that is not enough. What is required is an effective body without any vested interest in the organisation, which can act without fear or favour. Let me now turn to training and knowledge. The training of the LFB personnel across the organisation underpins everything. The failure to train those employed in the LFB, especially at an operational level, about cladding fires, about compartmentation breaches, was catastrophic. There was practically no high-rise firefighting training. There was a lack of suitable high-rise training tower facilities. The plain fact is, there were and still are inadequately prepared for the complex combined effect of such a fire and entirely lacking in practical and realistic training. There was no proper incident command training. There was a failure of Babcock to meet training targets, in particular in relation to incident commands. And there was a lack of adequate training in the control room, including FSG management. And in terms of knowledge, a misguided and misconceived adherence to stay put as an article of faith. The corollary to this being a failure to understand the value and the need for proper evacuation planning for high-rise residential buildings. You see, public authorities have a duty of accountability. The London Fire Brigade, as a public body funded by taxpayers, is no different. As Londoners, we expect the LFB to effectively carry out its duties as an effective fire and rescue service. In the face of a catastrophic event such as the fire at Grenfell Tower, there is an inevitable public interest in scrutinising what actually happened. 72 lives were lost, families scarred forever, and the lives of an entire community irreversibly changed. It is an undeniable consequence of the fire at Grenfell that our clients, the Grenfell community, we as Londoners, and the British public are expecting the truth into what actually happened. Why did things go wrong? What are the factors that caused or contributed to the failings? There must be accountability in order for lessons to be learned, for there to be meaningful change, and to ensure that such a catastrophe is not repeated. Regrettably, all too often, public officers and the managers and controlling minds of private organisations who make money out of activities which cast responsibilities on them for public safety fail to act with candour and act in their own narrow interests and those of their organisation. Sometimes direct lies are told, sometimes the facts are manipulated, sometimes omissions are made which impede the search for truth. In this country, and no doubt many other, when things go wrong and there are official investigations, there is a culture of denial and a pervasive institutional defensiveness. Regrettably, the LFB's response to this inquiry has perpetuated a culture of denial and persuasive institutional defensiveness. You know, the experiences of the Hillsborough families waiting for 25 years for accountability, which came in part through the conclusion in the inquest in 2016, and which was sadly too late for some of the families, was a watershed moment in British history. Never again should families be taken through the mill of obfuscation and the denial of truth by public authorities. This led to the tabling of the Public Authorities Accountability Bill, also referred to as Hillsborough's Law, which calls for a statutory duty of candour by public authorities. In summary, the Public Authority Accountability Bill provides as follows. A, to set out a requirement on public institutions, public servants and officials, and those who are carrying out functions on their behalf to act in the public interest with candour and frankness. B, to define the public law duty on them to assist the courts, official inquiries and investigations. C, to enable victims to enforce such duties. D, to create offences for breaches of certain duties. And E, to provide funding for victims and their relatives in certain proceedings before courts and at official inquiries and investigations for connected purposes. What's that got to do with all of this? Well, our clients support the call for a statutory duty of candour as set out in the Public Authorities Accountability Bill, which we invite the panel to support in its recommendations. You will have read the powerful words of our client, Adele Chowdhury, in our written submissions, which we will repeat as a renewal for the public call for accountability bill to be enacted into law. And let me quote from Adele. I just want to start with how Grenfell differs from Hillsborough. Unlike the struggle faced by the Hillsborough families, the very public and shocking image of a residential tower in the very centre of our nation's capital meant that after an initial period of shock and inaction by central government, a decision was made to grant the Grenfell families exceptional legal funding, which during our inquiry has enabled our legal representatives first time round to shine a light on the failings. This is a huge contrast to the decades-long fight experienced by the families at Hillsborough and others. Where our experiences match other families is a complete lack of candour. We still see those bodies defending the indefensible rather than cutting their losses. The amount of amnesia we've seen, even undeclared evidence being discovered during the course of the inquiry, shows that the finely tuned structure of justice in the UK is simply not balanced fairly between everyday victims and what are effectively much richer suspects or even perpetrators responsible for the deaths of their loved ones. We are very aware of the risks that any absence of candour has on holding people accountable for the deaths of our loved ones. But parity of arms and freedom of information doesn't extend to private bodies like Arconic, Celotex, Kingspan or Ryden, who, despite damning evidence, remain bullish, demanding evidential protection against prosecution and in some cases even refusing to give evidence. For us, this is a key part of the proposed Hillsborough law. If you're happy to accept and profit from taxpayer public money, you must accept the same public body responsibility and accountability. When companies defend an indefensible position simply because they can spend their way out of accountability, it causes years of pain and suffering to generations still fighting for their ancestors and a huge cost to the taxpayer. End quote. Let me turn now, if I may, to the Fire Officers Association and their submissions. I've spoken at length in these submissions about the duty of candour. At the heart of this call for this is recognition of the problem. A lack of accountability by public bodies, a closing of ranks, and the all too prevalent danger of such behaviour leading to a repetition of past failures and wrongdoing. This is endemic within many public bodies in this country. In this inquiry, this is not just found in the LFB. We charge RBKC and the TMO, and most vehemently some of the corporate CPs from the construction industry with a culture of denial and institutional defensiveness. It's worth just reminding ourselves of the words of the Right Reverend James Jones, KBE, the former Bishop of Liverpool and the chair of Hillsborough Independent Panel, writing in November 2017 in his report, quote, "The patronising disposition of unaccountable power, a report to ensure the pain and suffering of the Hillsborough families is not repeated. The Hillsborough families are not the only ones who have suffered from the patronising disposition of unaccountable power. The families know that there are others who have found that when, in all innocence and with good conscience, they have asked questions of those in authority on behalf of those they love, the institutions have closed ranks, refused to disclose information, used public money to defend its interests, and acted in a way that was both intimidating and oppressive. And so the Hillsborough families' struggle to gain justice for the 96 has a vicarious quality to it, so that whatever they can achieve and call into account those in authority is of value to the whole nation. If greater illustration were required for the urgency of the Public Authority Accountability Bill, one need look no further than the closing submissions filed on behalf of the Fire Officers Association. Whilst brevity and conciseness are often to be admired in legal documents, the 19 pages provided by the FOA tells this inquiry all it needs to know about how little regard the Fire Officers Association had for the extremely trenchant criticisms that have come their way from the experts, from the families, the BSRs, the expert witnesses. Further, their understanding of the performance of their own witnesses seems very much removed from the reality that the rest of us saw. On its website, on the FOA's website, it states, quote, "FOA membership is open to all UK fire and rescue service staff and workers in the fire and rescue related roles in other industries. The association provides individual and collective representation to members locally and at a national level. We represent the FRS, uniform middle management roles, through membership of the middle management negotiating body of the National Joint Council for UK Fire and Rescue Services. No portion of any member's subscription goes to a political party or is used for political purposes. Our members' interests come first, and we believe that these are best served through constructive consultation and negotiation rather than traditional trade union muscle flexing. In this way, we can play a constructive role in the changes that are inevitably taking place within the service. If confrontation is at the forefront of any agenda, real progress cannot be made and benefits will not materialise." End quote. These submissions filed on their behalf are in equal parts surprising, disappointing and insulting. The opening gambit of its 19 pages is entirely self-serving. There is absolutely no recognition of what Module 5 and 6 sought to investigate. There is no ownership of any failings on their part, no acknowledgement of the Lacanau recommendations at all. Of course, the FOA members did not cause the fire, but that is an obvious remark. But it fails to recognise the purpose and scope of Modules 5 and 6. The LFB as an organisation played a key and vital role on that night of the fire and was found wanting. That is a state of affairs that should worry and alarm any fire and rescue service, which leads me to the next point. Where is the learning? There is no sense of self-analysis in the document. What shines through is institutional defensiveness. The FOA's closing submissions state at paragraph 12, quote, "The fire at Grenfell Tower was an altogether different nature from any other fire LFB officers, including RW, had ever experienced. The speed and ferocity of the spread made it unique. Senior officers, including RW, had received no training that would have or did equip them to manage the enormity of the challenges caused by the fire, resulting in a wholesale failure of those who refurbished the tower to do so lawfully and safely." End quote. This is very much in line with the mantra peddled by Dan Daly, the former head of fire safety, who remains Assistant Commissioner, who gave evidence to the inquiry on the 30th of September of last year. The inquiry was shown the LFB's presentation entitled Tall Buildings Facades, dated July 2016, in which a slide label, General Conclusion, referred to the need to understand products being used in facade systems and their fire behaviour, as well as if they are used appropriately and meet the need of relevant guidance. The slides further added these could affect the way fires develop and spread in the building. It is astonishing that none of the operational firefighters who gave evidence to the inquiry in Phase 1 had seen this presentation. Further, it was never distributed to the most operational LFB staff, including incident commanders and control room staff. Pressed on why watch managers were not made aware of these conclusions, Mr. Daly argued that the presentation was, quote, more a document that reassured that the regulations were there to do their job, end quote. He added, quote, I think what we witnessed at Grenfell is something very, very different to what our experience and exposure was at the time. Our clients listened to that evidence and read the words of the FOA's closing submissions with disbelief. The FOA seemed to inhabit a parallel universe in which well-publicised cladding fires around the world did not happen. Jonathan Sakula, given evidence earlier to this inquiry, said that the combustibility of building systems similar to that used in Grenfell Tower were well known. Mr. Sakula highlighted several fires that were propagated by aluminium composite materials, cladding, and polyurethane core, the same combustion that caused the fire to spread at Grenfell Tower, where 72 people were killed. Some of the fires listed in a report he prepared for the inquiry included the 2013 Al Hafid Tower in Sharjah in the United Arab Emirates, the 2015 fire at the 63-storey address hotel in Dubai, and one in Ramat Gan, Israel, in 2016. No fatalities were reported with the two of these fires, with one death at the address hotel incident. But in their parallel universe, presumably the FOA did not take note of the cladding fires in this country as well. The BBC's programme, 5 Fires That Foretold Grenfell, makes for chilling viewing. The programme explores the causes, subsequent investigations and the recommendations that were sent to successive UK governments. The 5 fires revisited included Summerland disaster on Douglas in the Isle of Man, 1973, the Knowsley Height fire in Liverpool in 1991, the Garnock Court fire in North Ayrshire in 1999, the Harrow Court fire in Stevenage in 2005, and Lacanau in 2009. The inquiry was also shown a slideshow prepared by Kevin Hughes, the LFB head of fire engineering and specialist fire safety, to be delivered at a Tall Buildings Conference in London in June 2017, a week after Grenfell. He sent his presentation to colleagues for comment with speaker notes in draft form in May 2017, asking for feedback. His notes stated that, quote, flammable building facades are a common challenge for the LFB. In residential buildings, a fire is not confined to the flat of origin, and our stay-put limited evacuation strategy is compromised. Mr. Hughes further wrote, large-scale evacuations in residential buildings, especially those with single staircases, cause a problem in terms of staircase capacity and obstruction to firefighters. The reason for highlighting this is to raise awareness of the problem. I believe that the codes and fire engineering principles we use to design fire safety into buildings are excellent, but facade fires and uncontrolled spread of fire across the outside of a tall building is a significant threat to the effectiveness of many systems within the buildings. They knew. The subsequent exchange between Dan Daly and Mr. Millett of Queen's Counsel, it was illuminating. Mr. Millett, some people may regard the timing of what I've just read to you as prophetic in many ways, but my question for you is what I've just read to you not considered to be something that all watch managers who are going to be likely to be attending as first responders at high-rise fires in London should have known? Answer. I think when you look at the words here, I completely agree that an outcome that you'd like to see, I think as the lead for fire safety, I would have been looking to evidence examples of that and to put in place appropriate awareness packages. Question. Would you agree that here is a clear indication that the Fire Safety Department was aware before Grenfell fire that a stay-put strategy may not be suitable for a high-rise block which has non-compliant cladding? Answer. I would say that certainly my opinion at the time was that stay-put is absolutely incumbent on compartmentation working, that if we were to have an example of those compartments could be overwhelmed or overrun, then that would compromise stay-put. Mr. Daly accepted that he was, quote, not sure we've always taken every opportunity to learn as an organisation, end quote. Protection wasn't always as high up on the agenda as it needed to be, and so opportunities to learn from protection haven't always been as well addressed. I think we're better now. Mr. Daly was also asked about the fire at Magdalen House in Kingston in 2010. A consultant's report following the fire found that multiple materials used in Magdalen House external facade, quote, had no resistance to ignition and spread flame, producing large volumes of dense black smoke. Following on from the fire, in an email, one LFB fire engineer discussed the possibility of recommending that early evacuation of the building should be considered. At Magdalen House, 3 sister blocks in the event of a future fire. Asked by Mr. Millett of Queen's Counsel, question, so the Magdalen fire you would accept as a good example of a learning event for the LFB where no learning or insufficient learning was taken? Answer. I don't know that no learning was done, but as an officer in the Brigade at the time, I should have known about something related to this fire from what you have demonstrated, and I wasn't aware of until today. At Grenfell Towers, Dr. Lane opined, we saw total building failure. And the fire, in terms of its ferocity and speed and spread, were indeed something that those present had never personally experienced before. But they did and should have had, firstly, the knowledge and training to enable them to identify Grenfell as a cladding fire, and therefore been equipped to be cognizant of all that comes with such a fire. Secondly, they should have had or been aware that and been better prepared in terms of their firefighting strategy. They should have had an understanding of the potential for compartmentation failure, and they should have been ready with contingencies, including evacuation planning. The bold assertion at paragraph 12 of the FOA statement is disingenuous and fails to acknowledge any failings on the part of the LFB. Stay put. National guidance requires Fire and Rescue Service to draw up contingency evacuation plans for dealing with fires in high-rise buildings that spread beyond the compartment of origin, causing a stay-put strategy to become untenable. The LFB's policy for fighting fires in high-rise buildings, that's PN 633, envisages that evacuation of a high-rise building, residential building, may be necessary and suggests that during familiarisation visits, officers should consider evacuation arrangements. So let me turn to Richard Welch. The impression given by the FOA submissions characterised Richard Welch as a bemused bystander looking on in shock and awe at the horror blaze unfolding before his eyes that night. It's almost as if the FOA wished to cast him in the same light as the residents and onlookers from the surrounding estates, who did look on with a total sense of impotence, unable to fathom with what their eyes were seeing, unable to do anything to stop the blaze or to help the residents. But such a comparison between Mr. Welch and the residents or onlookers is both insulting and wholly wrong. Mr. Welch and the other senior officers who attended were not mere bystanders. They were professionals. They were individuals who should have known and who should have been aware or who should have been sufficiently trained. Evacuation planning. The adherence to stay put and the presumption that compartmentation was a fail-safe measure meant that the LFB did not even contemplate evacuation planning or strategies for Grenfell Tower. Evacuation plans cannot be done on the hoof. They require pre-planning. That then takes us back to the foundations of LFB policies, namely Section 7.2D. Whatever assumption or presumptions the FOA or Richard Welch relied upon, the compartmentation breach of Mr. Kabidi's flat was a first and early sign that matters were not going to follow assumptions and presumptions that night. The fire spread was the second. The sad reality is, as found by the chair in Phase 1. The FOA asking you, sir, to revisit your Phase 1 report. Let me turn to that. The Phase 1 report and the executive summary, sir, you found that the LFB to be gravely inadequate concerning incident command and the senior officer's lack of training, read the dangers associated with combustible cladding, incident command training, no evacuation and contingency planning, ORD contained little or no relevant information of the use to the incident commanders. Basic information held about the tower was wrong. In the light of those findings, the Fire Officers Association submission state at paragraph 53, quote, "In these circumstances, the learned chairman ought respectfully to revisit his findings in this regard in his Phase 1 report." This closing statement is as astonishing and audacious as their opening one, and returns the FOA to their alternative reality. It shows a cavalier disregard for the work and investigation of the inquiry thus far, and moreover, we say, shows contempt for the BSRs and the memories of their loved ones who lost their lives on that night. The closing submissions of the Fire Officers Association and the London Fire Commissioners, taken together, make a mockery of accountability and reflects badly on the semblance of accountability for the LFB. The London Fire Commissioners' response. The London Commissioners have, on the one hand, in their written submissions, reminded the inquiry of the Commissioners' evidence. Quote, "Large organisations must always develop policy and procedure through learning from experience, and that culture must be embedded and never ending, expressing his determination to ensure that London Fire Brigade is proactive in its approach, particularly with regard to the increasing complexity of modern construction and design methods and materials insofar as they impact on fire safety, end quote. This is, of course, contrasted, on the other hand, with the Fire Officers Association's call for the inquiry to revisit its Phase 1 findings of the LFB's failures on the night. We are left questioning the express candour of the LFB. In the London Chief Commissioner's written submissions at paragraphs 7 and 8, from which we highlight, quote, in short, the LFC's fully acknowledges responsibility for the Brigade's operational response to the Grenfell Tower fire and is firmly committed to ensuring, wherever possible, that lessons which must be learned are acted upon robustly. It begs this question. Is this the same organisation? Whilst we do not challenge the integrity and the commitment of individual firefighters, the contrasting submissions of the LFC and the FOA place a stoplight on the culture of institutional defensiveness of the LFC and an unwillingness to change, where the words of the commissioners become just mere lip service. Notwithstanding the LFC's purported commitment to candour, the commissioners' acknowledgement of the known risk of cladding fires, it is of note that the LFC's response to the LFB's failure to have considered the effectiveness of evacuation at night or the absence of an evacuation policy, see paragraph 82 of the LFC submissions, has the hallmarks of institutional defensiveness, which invariably impacts on the implementation of meaningful change. You see, what's needed is this: the establishment of an independent operational assurance advisor reporting to the LFC. That's a positive step towards the assurance of oversight. Its success is wholly dependent on the collective commitment of the institution of the LFB. The FOA's closing statements do not imbue confidence in such a commitment. The stark contrast between the FOA's and the LFC's submissions underscores the problems and the difficulties we identify for Mr. Rowe. How can he reconcile these differing stances? How can the inquiry be satisfied that the LFB as an organisation will accept and act upon any failings which are found in Phase 2? The changes implemented since Grenfell. We, of course, welcome the changes that have been implemented by the LFB since Grenfell, and in particular, we welcome the use of fire escape hoods, smoke blockers, the new turntable appliance, drone capabilities, which provide situational awareness to incident commanders, to aid decisions making, and capability of smaller drones to be fitted with loudspeakers for broadcasting public messages. And may I add, and I add this particularly in relation to my client Nabil Chahir, who lost his family, 6 members of his family. You know, he would wish me to make the point that it's really important that this new technology, proper camera system, time-stamp recordings, the speaker system that can actually be heard, that the systems actually work in the event of a serious fire. We note the revisions of policies to address the deficiencies in high-rise firefighting, evacuation and fire survival guidance, which all purport to address the LFB's deficiencies borne out in its response to Grenfell. We are sure, and it's not lost on the panel and indeed the inquiry team, that the LFB is awash with policies. Arguably, there's a policy for every day of the year. But as we can all acknowledge from this evidence we heard in Phase 1 and Modules 5 and 6, there have been serious inadequacies in the training of operational firefighters on policy and the operation of equipment. The reported revision of the control room and the rolling out of technology is as good as the resourcing and upgrading of technology to ensure that it works, and equipping the control staff with adequate training to use the resources at hand, lest the FSG apps will be beleaguered with the same fate as the CU equipment, which we heard in phase 1, which never worked. It's really important that if you've got the technology, make sure it works. We're equally concerned that, notwithstanding the acknowledged failing of the Barry radios at Grenfell, which was a well-known fact in the LFB, Barry radios are still being used by operational firefighters. Let me turn to the FBU submissions. The FBU submissions, in contrast, does seem to dwell in the same reality as the rest of us. There is some reflection and acceptance, and provide important context and analysis with regards to the issue of industrial action and any alleged correlation between that and the failures to implement Lacanau recommendations, training and the socio-political climate. The leadership under Mr. Dobson failed in its rank and file members, and it failed its rank and file members, and it failed Londoners. He and others at the very top of the organisation acquiesced rather than take on Johnson. We wholeheartedly agree with the FBU's closing submissions at paragraphs 4 to 6. The individual private companies did create an unsafe building. We have been forceful and consistent in our criticism of the LFB and the firefighting operation on the night, and what we described as the systemic failings of the organisation. But as noted in the FBU submissions at paragraph 4, whatever the weakness and indeed the failings of the LFB on the 14th of June, there can be little doubt that the disaster was caused by a combination of significant failings by individual private companies in pursuit of profit above all, and a generation of policies by central government, including deregulation, the war on the culture of health and safety, privatisation, austerity and cuts of public services, including the FRS, and the decrease in degradation of social housing. City Hall, under the leadership of the then Mayor of London, Boris Johnson, was ruthless in the pursuit of cuts, and the FRS was not exempt from the axe. We do maintain that the culture of the LFB as an organisation has acted as a barrier to effective change and has led to institutional defensiveness. We look more at the evidence of a witness such as Rita Dexter. Rita Dexter was aware of the quality and nature of the 7.2D visits was variable and therefore systemic and long-standing systemic failure. She attributes much of this to the ingrained attitude and behaviour down to the culture of the LFB. It was a culture that was resistant to change, the corollary of what was things that required urgent attention and rectification, which were allowed to continue, deteriorate and stagnate. Training and knowledge. It's true that the FBU had warned about cladding for many years and the consequences of cladding fires, and it's a tragedy that the wider organisation did not listen to the FBU. This is where training is so important. We have consistently stated that the inquiry needs to examine the role of Babcock and training that they provided. We welcome and endorse the submissions in relation to training by the FBU at paragraph 72 to 74 of their submissions. There is an acknowledgement by the FBU that there were failings, and again we agree and endorse the submissions at paragraph 75 through to 99 in relation to the failure of senior leadership of the organisation to transfer knowledge and information throughout the organisation, complacency of leadership, the failure of leadership to consider that a fire such as Grenfell could happen, outsourcing of training to Babcock, and the role of former Commissioner Dobson, austerity and cuts. We are in line with the FBU on those points. Let me turn now to the National Oversight Mechanism. The continued failure of public authorities to implement inquiry recommendations and prevention of further deaths reports arising from inquests, as we've seen from the LFB's treatment of the Coroner's Rule 43 recommendations, places this inquiry's recommendations to suffer a similar fate in the absence of an independent body charged with the implementation of your recommendations. We are likely to hear further evidence in Module 7 from experts on the formidable challenges faced by those seeking to secure meaningful change after a tragedy like Grenfell Fire. Evidence that may help us understand why the recommendations from Lakanal were not implemented and why, without a national oversight mechanism coupled with a duty of candour, it is not just a risk but likely reality that any changes recommended by you risk suffering the same fate as the recommendations from Lakanal. More lives will be lost. The 72 will have died in vain. Accordingly, sir, we invite this inquiry to adopt the recommendations of inquest for the establishment of a national oversight mechanism, which is an independent body with the duty to collate, analyse and monitor and currently disparate, hard to access and locally held recommendations of coroners and other post-death investigations and inquiries, which was adopted by the recommendations of the Justice Working Party when things go wrong. The rationale behind this is to ensure compliance after you make your recommendations. I remind the panel during our Module 6 opening statement of Nicholas Burton's evidence and his plea for accountability, which, in the light of the LFB's demonstrable lack of candour, is worth repeating, if only to remind the public authorities, including the LFB, RBKC, TMO and DCLG, that their decisions and consequential outcomes affect real lives. The bereaved, survivors, residents for whom justice without truth and accountability is just a fleeting illusion to be pursued but will never be attained. An extract from Nicholas Burton's evidence is, quote, "The consciousness of the nation is looking at us all. How this inquiry, how the police investigation is going, but this is so important that it has to stop here. We've seen failings and failings. I've been failed so many times, and failings with other fires and other lessons not learned. So Grenfell has to stand for something, and it's got to stop here about how people are treated and how loopholes in the systems need to be closed." A response, obfuscation, lack of candour, refusal to accept this inquiry's findings, as the Fire Officers Association submissions indicate, perpetuates these failings. This reinforces the need for a statutory duty of candour and a national oversight mechanism. I finish where I started. The one message that this inquiry can powerfully send out to the LFB is this: mistakes are meant for learning, not repeating. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. The next statement is going to be made in a moment by Mr. Browne, Queen's Counsel. He's going to make his statement from a remote location, and we're going to have a 5-minute break at this point just to make sure that we've established all the communications. So we'll rise for 5 minutes. We'll resume at 12:20, please, and we shall hear Mr. Browne. Thank you. Now, the next statement is going to be made by Mr. Browne, Queen's Counsel, on behalf of the Fire Officers Association, and Mr. Welch. So the first thing to do is to make sure that we can see and hear each other. Good morning, Mr. Browne.
Good morning to you, sir.
And you can see me and hear me, I hope?
I can, thank you.
Thank you. And we can see you. So when you're ready, please make your statement.
Thank you very much. Mr. Chairman, can I begin by making some brief observations, please, before turning to the submissions themselves? Firstly, we were very sorry that our closing submissions for these modules have caused the upset expressed by Professor Thomas, Queen's Counsel, in his submissions. You will know, sir, that we have, during our participation in inquiry, frequently expressed our sincere sympathy and condolences to the bereaved survivors and residents for the losses they suffered as a result of this appalling tragedy. And nothing that I say on behalf of those who instruct me, our clients, should be taken as in any way diminishing those condolences and sympathy. Secondly, Mr. Welsh was motivated purely by a desire to save lives of the residents who were in the tower that night. And we don't in any way seek to put him in the same position as the residents in the tower. He was, of course, a professional firefighter and should be treated as such. However, his actions should not be treated with the benefit of hindsight, but should be assessed with the benefit of the knowledge that he had, or reasonably to have had, on the night. And finally, this, were there are lessons to be learned as a result of your findings, both in phase 1 and phase 2, they will and must be learned. So having made those, I hope, helpful introductory comments, can I then begin with our submissions? We begin by asking the question, where does the real failure for the fire and deaths at Grenfell Tower lie? And we maintain the position, respectfully, that it is easier to begin by stating where it does not lie. It does not lie with the individual LFB officers and staff who tried heroically to quell the fire and rescue as many lives as possible. On the night of the fire, critical and crucial decisions were made by LFB officers and staff on the assumption, an entirely reasonable assumption we respectfully submit, that the provisions of the building regulations and approved document B were fit for purpose and had been complied with. They clearly were not, and central government should have known they were not. We agree with and respectfully adopt the submissions of the FBU and its opening submissions for these modules on the failure of successive governments in this regard. Further, we agree with and adopt the submissions made on behalf of the Mayor of London in his opening submissions for these modules as to the failures and the consequences of those failures of central government, particularly the failures to take any or any effective action to implement Rule 43 recommendations after the fire at Lakanal House. Put shortly, had central government complied with its duties of regulation and enforcement, had the manufacturers of the cladding and its composite parts complied with their implicit duty of good faith to supply materials for certification which met regulatory requirements, and had building control properly discharged its duty to ensure compliance with regulations, including issues as to design safety, then the cladding installed at Grenfell Tower would not have been authorised and installed, in which case a fire of such catastrophic proportions with such devastating loss of life would not have occurred. Can I then turn, please, to consider the preparedness of LFB officers and staff to deal with the fire at Grenfell Tower and the enormity of the challenges posed by it? In his oral evidence, LFB former Commissioner Ron Dobson said, "I wish we'd taken a number of actions in relation to the evacuation of high-rise buildings. But as I explained to you yesterday, whilst it was a risk, and whilst we knew evacuation did take place, it was difficult to identify what the steps would be that you would tell firefighters to take to actually manage a full evacuation in a residential high-rise building where there was no central fire alarm and no record of who was in the building or not." He was asked, was there a need to ensure that operational firefighters, indeed officers of all rank, were better aware of the limitations of stay put and had considered the prospect of evacuation in a high-rise residential building should the need arise? And he answered yes. In his oral evidence, Commissioner Rowe said this about LFB training on the risk of cladding fires. I think this was about how we dealt with a specific risk that was known to one part of the organisation, but hadn't necessarily been effectively communicated to another part of the organisation. We knew about the possibility of exterior cladding fire, but we hadn't communicated it effectively internally. On the issue of widespread compartmentation failure, leading to the untenability of stay put, Commissioner Rowe said this: I think where we didn't do enough for our officers and crews was actually to prepare them for how they might deal with that situation should it confront them. That didn't translate into training as to how you might address it. Further, what I would hold to this day is that the totality, the scale, and the extremity of the failure of every single part of regulation and human behaviour that should underpin it would have been difficult to predict. I think what caught people by utter surprise, and I would include myself, in the first few moments of the Grenfell Tower fire was just the totality of it. It seemed almost unbelievable to me that we would lose an entire residential block in modern Britain. You know, it still shocks me to this day because I think it says something about all the systems and institutions that should have kept those people safe. We had not conceived the scale of failure that we encountered at Grenfell. It seems almost unimaginable to me. I'm not sure that at this point, if we were planning in response, we would have planned for the totality of that failure. However, we should still have prepared our people for what they might do if they did experience something on that scale. Commissioner Rowe, rightly in our respectful submission, said this: I would go back to the point that, at the point people arrived at that incident, the speed with which the fire developed, the extremity of it, and the totality of the failure made everything extremely difficult in terms of decision making. So I have real sympathy for the officers who arrived at that incident in the early stages, because it would, I imagine, have felt overwhelming in terms of the scale and the rapidity of the fire spread and the unusual nature by which it was spreading. Although this was criticised, it is correct that the fire at Grenfell Tower was of an altogether different nature from any other fire LFB officers, including Mr. Welch, had ever experienced. The speed and ferocity of the spread made it unique in their experience. Senior officers, including Mr. Welch, had received no training that would have or did equip them to manage the enormity of the challenges caused by a fire resulting from a wholesale failure of those who refurbished the tower to do so lawfully and safely. And Dr. Lane's opinion is, we respectfully submit, cogent. Based upon the relevant test evidence, the construction materials forming the rain screen cladding, when considered either individually or as an assembly, did not comply with the recommended fire performance in the approved document, B. The entire system could not adequately resist the spread of fire over the walls, having regard to height, use and position of the building. Specifically, the assembly failed adequately to resist the spread of fire to an extent that supported the required stay-put strategy for Grenfell Tower. The assembly failed adequately to resist the spread of fire to an extent that supported the required internal and firefighting defend-in-place regime. The cladding presented an extreme and primary hazard. In the event of any internal fire starting near a window, there was a disproportionately high probability of fire spread into the rain screen cladding system. The type of materials in the rain screen cladding and how they were arranged around the window in the kitchen contributed to the speed in which the fire spread from the flat of origin to a multi-story external fire within the rain screen system. A full geometric grid was created by means of the construction materials, which connected, in the event of an internal fire, cavity fire, or external fire, every flat on a story and every story from level 2 to roof level. These pathways also supported the spread of external fire back into the building through the windows and created a series of internal fire events. The consequence of this was that any individual flat of fire origin was no longer in a separate fire-rated box as required. The compartmentation required in the building was breached by the ability of the fire to spread on the external wall from that compartmented flat to the next. And as she put it, a building with this form of external wall could never provide the high degree of compartmentation required to support stay put. Professor Bisbee said that such a fire spread was inevitable. The required single safety condition, stay put, was not provided for as was required as a result of the rain screen system installed during the refurbishment. And Grenfell Tower should never have been handed over with this system where a stay put strategy was in place. Dr. Lane did not consider it reasonable that, in the event of the installation of a combustible rain screen system on a high-rise residential building, the fire brigade should be fully expected to mitigate fully any resulting fire event. That was particularly so where the brigade had never been informed that a combustible rain screen system had been installed. There are so many combinations of events that could fall entirely outside the reach of external firefighting activity that this was, and I quote, important when only internal firefighting arrangements are made for high-rise residential buildings by statutory guidance at this time. Her overall conclusion was that there were multiple catastrophic fire routes created by the construction, form and construction detailing that was used. The cladding as configured at the tower rendered it unsuitable for a stay-put policy. Once fire was within the cladding, there was nothing to impede the spread of fire and smoke around the building, and this created the conditions for a catastrophic fire event to occur. As stated, none of those matters were matters known to the LFB, those taking command decisions on the night of the fire. As was noted by Professor Bisbee when he gave oral evidence, external firefighting was likely to have had little effect. The single stair and lobbies and the fire safety provisions therein were not ever designed to create a safe escape route or a safe working environment in a whole building fire. The design approach for high-rise residential buildings is based upon inhibiting that from occurring. The net effect of all of this is that those LFB personnel taking command decisions on the night had no prior opportunity to consider their firefighting and rescue tactics, as well as any evacuation guidance to residents having regard to how the fire was likely to behave and spread once on the exterior of the building. So as regards the non-compliance of the active and passive firefighting measures at the tower, we respectfully refer to our closing submissions for phase 1, paragraphs 8 to 14, which we say respectfully remain entirely relevant and in force when considering the issues relevant to modules 5 and 6 in this phase. What then of the recognition of the need to abandon stay put sooner? The stay put strategy as defined by Dr. Lane is, as you know, sir, the concept of occupants in dwellings adjoining the dwelling on fire being safe if they remain where they are. As she pointed out, stay put was a building safety condition which relies on active and passive fire protection measures. It had formed the basis of high-rise residential buildings fire safety guidance in the UK from 1971. Since the stay-put strategy was a building design condition, the LFB officers in command reasonably relied upon this building design condition on the night of the fire. There is no building design function in a high-rise residential building provided to enable firefighters in the UK to communicate any change in their evacuation or rescue guidance from within the building. That the stay-put strategy applied to Grenfell Tower at the time of the fire is clear. The RBKC TMO Ryden Grenfell Tower Regeneration newsletter for July 2014, under the section Emergency Fire Arrangements, made it quite clear that the stay-put policy remained in force until residents were told otherwise. And that was because, and I quote, Grenfell was designed according to rigorous fire safety standards. Also, the new front doors for each flat can withstand a fire for up to 30 minutes, close quotes. Forgive me, which gives plenty of time for the fire brigade to arrive, close quotes. The stay-put strategy requires compliance by the building owner with the active and passive and other fire protection measures within a high-rise residential building. Where a stay-put strategy is in place, additional protection to the staircase should be provided in the form of a smoke control system. External walls should be constructed using a material that does not support fire spread and therefore endanger people in or around the building. Flame spread over or within an external wall construction should be controlled to avoid creating a route for rapid fire spread bypassing compartment floors or walls, and combustible materials should not be used in cladding systems and extensive cavities. What then did Mr. Welch need to know? Mr. Welch and in fact other senior officers in the tower need to know, re-abandoning stay put, but did not know at the time. Mr. Welch had received no training that equipped him to appreciate why the fire at Grenfell Tower, A, was behaving as it was, B, that might be behaving in this way because there was external cladding in place, which was constructed of materials that did not comply with building regulations, C, this required sufficient understanding of building construction, fire engineering, fire dynamics, human behavior, and how those factors interacted with each other against the backdrop of the actual fire itself and how it appeared to be behaving. Further, that this may affect the viability of the stay put policy and how, if stay put was to be abandoned, any evacuation attempt might viably be achieved. He and the other incident commanders would not have known what is now known, namely, that the cladding system contained insulation which was combustible, that ACM range screen panels contained a highly combustible polyethylene core, and that the system did not comply with the functional requirements B4.1 of Schedule 1 to the regulations, and the external walls of the building did not resist and indeed actively promoted the spread of fire. He and other incident commanders would not have known what is now known, namely, the fire entrance doors were not compliant with the building regulations. 64% of flat entrance doors, self-closing devices, were either broken or missing. The mounts master door sets were not capable of achieving 30 minutes of fire and smoke resistance, and when tested by BRE in February 2018, their integrity fell within 15 minutes. It was inevitable that those factors increased the speed and ferocity of internal fire and smoke spread. As to the viability of a full evacuation, it is of critical importance here to appreciate that there is still no national or local guidance as to how a viable evacuation could have been achieved, and we will turn to this shortly. As to Mr. Welch's actions on the night, as is known, sir, he was status 3 at 01:57:21. On arrival, a glimpse of the tower suggested that the east side of it was alight. However, he was unable to see at that time whether the fire had penetrated from the exterior back into the flats. As the fire was by then a 25 pump fire, and he was, so he understood at the time, the senior officer present, he took over as IC. He requested various messages to be sent as set out in our submissions at paragraph 27, and he explained his rationale for those, namely that life will always come first, so the priority was to get the people. The decision as to the sufficiency of resources, in particular EDBA wearers, was one that he would consider when inside the tower, so as being able at that point to obtain a better situational awareness of where we were, what the aims were, what our difficulties were. At the point when he requested to make pumps 40, he still thought that the fire was on the exterior face. He also took those steps set out in paragraph 31 of our submissions and at 32. His strategy as IC was to reach FSG callers as quickly as possible and remove them from the building or get them to a safe place. In the short time he was at IC, incident commander, he did not have thoughts that the stay put policy should be revoked or changed to an all out. In his oral evidence, he explained his thinking. He said, I had no reason to think that the building compartmentation would be failing and that the fire would be spreading across that way because it's not something that we see. The stay put policy works time and time again, so I believed in that policy. While he was on CU8, he was informed by DAC O'Loughlin that DAC O'Loughlin was incident commander. Mr. Welch informed him of the messages that he had sent, and DAC O'Loughlin agreed with what he had done and indicated he would have sent the same messages. He was given the role of fire sector commander, and in the case of Grenfell Tower, the fire sector was the entire building. From the point when Mr. Welch was incident commander, it would and should have been appreciated that he could not also have been acting as bulk media advisor. Once DAC O'Loughlin was appointed incident commander, it was then his responsibility to ensure the provision of an adequate water supply to the tower, which is a fundamental function of incident command. Save for a very short period of time, throughout the entirety of the relevant period, Mr. Welch was inside the tower, and the issue of the provision of an adequate water supply to the tower was not a matter which was his responsibility or over which he had any control. As to the remainder of his actions on the night and his rationale for them, we respectfully adopt and repeat paragraphs 71 to 97 of our closing submissions for phase 1. Mr. Welch had considerable experience of fighting high-rise residential fires, but with that experience, he would assume that Grenfell Tower, as originally built, appeared to have been designed on the premise of providing very high levels of passive fire protection. Turning then to Mr. McGurk's reports, while these were not matters he was asked to specifically address in his oral evidence, the following are, in our respectful submission, of importance. In his report, section D, Alternative Firefighting Research and Rescue Strategies, Mr. Welch referred to the Kent Fire and Rescue SAP. As regards that, RICE is simply a prompt or mnemonic. It is not a policy or procedure and offers no practical advice on how a full or partial evacuation is to be achieved in any situation. And certainly after 0158, RICE was of extremely limited relevance to the situation at the tower, since in the initial stages of the fire, which began on the 4th floor, 80% of the occupants were above the fire ground. Adopting the RICE model, floors 5 and 6 might have been considered primary areas needing to be evacuated due to imminent danger from the fire. However, in the time required to evacuate those floors, the speed and ferocity of fire spread was such that, in the meantime, many parts of the stairwell would have been compromised. The core activity underlying RICE, the maintenance of the integrity of the means of escape, was not achievable. Given the speed and ferocity of fire spread, it would not have been possible to determine, firstly, how the various parts of the stairwell, all subject to fluctuating conditions, might be protected and by whom. Secondly, how hoses might be deployed at which selected levels, at which times, and with what objective. In 20 questions on RICE, it is estimated that it would take 20 to 40 minutes to evacuate 350 people from a 20-story building in tenable conditions, with residents being of average age and fitness, with evacuees in single file on the stairway. Thus, whilst it might have been theoretically possible, and therefore it can be said that attempts should have been made to carry out a full evacuation, the RICE evacuation model would be compromised due to the absence of any effective means of communicating to residents any evacuation plan. Fire compartmentation had been subject to multiple failures. Conditions throughout sections of the stairway were not tenable. The integrity of the stairway had not and could not be maintained. And while some occupants were of average age and fitness, there was no available information with regard to numbers who were not fit and whose disabilities might impact on an orderly evacuation in single file. So as to the viability of self-evacuation and search and rescue, we adopt and repeat what we set out in paragraphs 98 to 109 of our closing submissions for phase 1. However, we also make the following points, please. The whole purpose of modern construction of high-rise residential buildings is compartmentation, and evacuation is, therefore, never really for consideration. Grenfell Tower, as originally built, did provide compartmentation. The effect of the refurbishment works would be to fatally undermine this building design component, but this was not appreciated at the time of the fire. Stay put was not LFB policy, but a nationally accepted design concept. Nationally, mass evacuation was not routinely considered, nor was any training given on the evidence, as was made clear by Professor Torero in his evidence. Training on full evacuation was not undertaken, partly because occasions where full evacuation were required were so rare. In the case of the LFB and following Lacanau, in consequence of the coroner's findings, no, the plan publicity campaign was to stay put. As a general observation, stay put was never intended to be universally applicable. The advice is, if we're not affected by smoke or flames, stay put. If you are so affected and can get out, do so. But what training was given and to what purpose? No adequate training was provided to the officers and firefighters by the LFB because evacuation was so rarely needed. Rice was not known, at least not well known prior to Grenfell, and there is no evidence that any evacuation technique training is undertaken by any fire and rescue service nearly 5 years after the fire. There has been evacuation training after the fire, but it deals with situations in which evacuation should be considered, not how evacuation is to be achieved. This is, in our respectful submissions, critical. It is one thing to say it should be considered. However, this wholly ignores the practical reality of whether it is viable and feasible. If so, how is it to be achieved in a building such as Grenfell Tower that did not permit it by reason of its construction and limitations? In terms of restrictions on evacuation on the night, we submit there's a distinction between mass or building-wide evacuation and the evacuation of individuals. Respectively, we submit it's not correct to assert that everyone instructed to evacuate would have succeeded in doing so themselves and would thereby have survived. As to national guidance and the absence of it, if consideration of evacuation is so important, which with new building materials and methods it is, one must ask, why is there no training on how to evacuate a building such as Grenfell Tower almost 5 years after the fire? Throughout the inquiry experts have acknowledged the difficulties in evacuation. For example, Mr. McGurk noted no tannoy or system to communicate with residents, the rapidity of fire spread, the failure of compartmentation, the stairwell becoming increasingly compromised, and the difficulties posed in evacuating residents with mobility issues. No expert has given evidence to how these difficulties of communication and smoke, etc., could be overcome. There simply has been no evidence as to method, simply the criticism that somehow LFB should have tried. If there was no means of communication, if the stairwells were smoke logged, the only people who could be evacuated were those who could be reached and escorted by firefighters. This is what officers Welsh, Goulburn, and all other firefighters set out to do. The formal declaration of abandonment of stay put was relevant to the control room, they being the only people in remote communication with those trapped in the tower. On the fire ground, evacuation was being put into practice when possible. The essential problem is this, respectfully. Building designs of the 1960s and 1970s specifically took account of the potential need to evacuate. They did so by eliminating that necessity by designing in the principle of compartmentation. Once that design is tampered with by alteration and refurbishment, compartmentation may no longer exist. At Grenfell Tower, it was not a case of compartmentation failing. It had been removed by the design of the refurbishment. The reason why no one can say how evacuation could have been viably achieved at Grenfell Tower or in an analogous situation is that the core design made evacuation unnecessary and impossible in a single staircase building. The only remedy would have been to have reverted to the initial design model. So in conclusion, we respectfully submit as follows. Mr. Welch was reasonably entitled to assume that Grenfell Tower had, in its refurbished state, been designed and built safely and in accordance with the building regulations. Therefore, he was entitled to assume that the building design concept of stay put remained valid. Tragically, this reasonable assumption was not valid because of the gross failures of those involved in the design, construction, and approval of the refurbishment. Fault for this tragedy and the enormous loss of life rests squarely with them. They cannot evade the responsibility by seeking to blame the actions of firefighters, including senior staff on the night. To permit them to do so would compound their egregious failures. Mr. Welsh had received no training which would have equipped him to appreciate how and why the fire at the tower was behaving as it was, and, other than doing what he did, what other actions might be taken in consequence. Even before the abandonment of stay put, the actions he took on the night were prompted by a desire to achieve the rescue and safe evacuation of as many occupants of the tower as possible. If it is still asserted a viable evacuation of residents was possible, then, in this task, he and his colleagues were hampered by the complete lack of A, any training as to how this might be achieved, B, the absence then and now of any practical guidance as to how this might be implemented. Respectfully, we maintain the position that for the reasons set out in our closing submissions for phase 1, paragraphs 98 to 109, a total evacuation, self or assisted, was never viable at Grenfell Tower within the short window of opportunity that existed. It is one matter to say a fuller evacuation should have been considered before the abandonment of stay put. However, it is an altogether different matter to say that such was viable. This all the more so when no single expert from whom the inquiry has heard has suggested how this could have been achieved with a greater saving of life. In those circumstances, Mr. Chairman, we very respectfully invite you to reconsider the phase 1 findings in this regard, to see the extent to which, if at all, they remain findings that you consider properly to be made. Thank you, sir.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Browne. The next statement is due to be made by Ms. Studd, Queen's Counsel, on behalf of the Mayor of London, but she's in the programme for 2 o'clock, and I think the sensible course now would therefore be to adjourn until 2 o'clock so that we all have time for some lunch. So, thank you very much. 2 o'clock then, please.